My name is Zachary Saltzman. I am in the College of Arts and Sciences, double majoring in economics and Spanish, and my advisor for my project is Profesora Adela Pineda, and it's titled A Mexican Sueño. And first, just to get a bit of background about my project, what I really wanted to do was to create a bilingual interconnected set of 3 short stories with 3 linguistic dynamics that are different in each story. The first story is called Sebastián, after the main character of that story, and it follows Sebastián, a journeyman, semi-professional soccer player in Juarez who is struggling to make it. The second story follows his wife, Luz, as she immigrates to Austin, Texas, and that is 10 years later. And the third story, Maria Josefa, follows her daughter, Maria Josefa, in her efforts to become a screenwriter and share her family's story of Juarez in Hollywood. So each story takes place 10 years apart and follows these 3 characters throughout their lives as they're either a primary character in one story, a secondary character in another story, and become a more like tertiary character in another story. So they kind of weave in and out. One of the major focuses of this was kind of the intersection of comedy and tragedy. I really wanted to write something that was fun for me to write and was also a bit more profound in a lot of its themes. So the 4 major characters, and this is the Estadio Azteca, the biggest stadium in Mexico City, which takes place one of the major scenes in the first short story. The first character is Sebastián Munoz, the father. He is 28 years old when the first story begins. And he is someone who is convinced he's going to be the next professional star in Mexico, but he doesn't have the talent to do so, and that leads him on a path of struggles. The second major character is Luz Williams Munoz, who is more of a secondary character in the first short story. She's the wife of Sebastian, and then adopts a much more prominent role in the second story as it's told from her narrative and her perspective. And the third major character, who Luz is pregnant with in the first story, is Maria, later known as Mary Josefa Munoz Williams. And she's 10 years old in the second story, and she's the narrator of the third story, which is written from her perspective. And then finally, there is Scott Williams, who is the stepfather of Maria Josefa and Luz's second husband, and he kind of plays a lot more of an antagonist role in the plot. So just to give you some plot of the first story, my main character is Sebastián, who's a 28-year-old backup center defensive midfielder on a struggling second division Mexican soccer team. And he has his dreams of playing on the biggest team in this country, Club America, and take his family out of poverty. And he works incessantly to achieve this dream. He practices 8 to 10 hours a day outside of his team training, goes through incredibly physically rigorous exercises and trainings to really push himself. He's convinced that he's 10,000 hours away from becoming a star. And as long as he works hard enough, he's going to become everything he wanted to always be. Unfortunately, he's not talented at all at soccer, is kind of the paradox of the story. He's someone who, yes, he's worked very hard and he's in very good physical shape, but he's not talented enough to start. He's not talented enough to play, and he's really only on the team to motivate the other players to train harder, which he doesn't really understand. One of sort of his neuroses, his pathologies, is that he's really addicted to cannabis and pain medication. He considers it part of his routine in order to play this really rigorous, go through his rigorous training regimen. And he doesn't consider himself an addict. He considers himself just trying to play every single day as best he can through pain and injury. But it's quickly becoming apparent that he's pushing everyone in his life away, his wife Luz, his soon-to-be newborn child, Maria Josefa, in pursuit of a dream that he's never going to achieve. So the plot of the second story, set 10 years later in Austin, Texas, is after some events happen, and Luz crosses the border with a newborn daughter to escape Sebastián, and she's now married to an American man named Scott Williams in Austin, Texas. She married Scott not so much out of passion, more so out of necessity and circumstance. And one of the central conflicts of this story is her struggle to maintain a close link to her culture, in spite of the fact that her new husband is in many cases trying to erase and silence her culture, primarily through not allowing her daughter, Maria Josefa, to learn Spanish, as he believes it will hinder her ability to make it in America. And Luz has a dream of her own. She dreams of starting a restaurant in Austin using recipes passed down from her mother, but finds herself financially dependent on Scott and makes a very drastic decision to pursue her dream that results in her becoming more and more distant from everyone around her. And then the plot of my third story, set 10 years after that, Maria Josefa is now 20, and she is dropped out of college in California without informing her parents, as one does, and is trying to make it as a screenwriter in Hollywood. And she has this massive, colossal amount of student debt. She's stressed about her parents. She thinks that that she's this God-given writing ability, and that's what's going to allow her to be a star. That like normal professional life is what's meant for her, and that she can make it as a screenwriter in Hollywood. And what she thinks to be her magnum opus, her great work, is the story of her parents in Juarez. And she sort of struggles to maintain her artistic integrity and her cultural authenticity as she works on this project and has to deal with a lot of the sharks in Hollywood. And sort of her really broken relationship with both her parents and her cultural heritage really informs a lot of her writing and leads her on a very troubled path. So some of the most prominent themes I wanted to really tackle in this work, in this project. I was always interested in underdog stories, but every underdog story I ever read, the guy ended up winning. And so I wanted to write an underdog story in which the underdog, like 99% of people, remained underdog and remained struggling, remained a failure kind of, and just their pursuit of this idealistic dream, but the fact of the matter is they're not going to achieve this dream. And to me, that's kind of the tragedy. So I really wanted to look about the tragedy of dreams, to really analyze what it's like to work, your butt off for years and years and years, doing insane things, pushing away friends and family in pursuit of something when you're just not going to get there. Sort of a third theme that I wanted to tackle is drug addiction. There is all three of the characters deal with some form of drug addiction, but it varies from character to character. Sebastian, he considers it as a routine. He does it every single day in the same exact amount, the same exact time, the same exact place, and he does not consider himself to be an addict. Luce, as in the second story, she abuses drugs more so to deal with her anxiety, and she justifies it as she only uses it when she's anxious. But the truth of the matter is that she's becoming increasingly more anxious and using it all the more. And then Maria Josefa also struggles with drug addiction, but to her it's just constant, it's continuous, it's ever present. She's just using it when she's happy, when she's sad, when she's anxious, when she's writing, when she's not writing, when she's work to do, when she's a project. It's just constant. And the fourth theme, assimilation versus cultural preservation. All these characters, they struggle with trying to be forced to assimilate into a new culture, a new setting, a new people, versus trying to maintain a lot of where they came from and then their cultural authenticity. And that is a struggle I think a lot of children of immigrants and immigrants experience in America. And one of the biggest theme I think in this, and this is why I called it a Mexican sueño, is I really wanted to criticize the idea of the American dream. I think the American dream is pretty much not fictitious. It's pretty fictitious in my opinion. And I think it's often used to weaponize as a weapon against immigrants and people of color especially. If the American dream is that you can do anything you want, you can be anything you want in society as long as, and you come from anywhere in the world, as long as you work hard, you can succeed in America. But I think the inverse, or the contrapositive to that, is what if you work so hard and you still don't achieve something in America? Is it your fault? I think that's what the American dream would seem to suggest, and I'm criticizing that idea. One of the two final themes are the power of language. I'll talk in a little bit in the next slide about the linguistic structure of the narrative, but I really wanted to sort of show how knowing a language, connecting with someone, it connects you with your people, with your culture, with your identity, with your home, and is really a great tool to open the world. And my final theme, and this comes from a lot of my background, is soccer. It's not a book about soccer, but the first story deals with lots of themes that I think are present in soccer. And just moving on. So my linguistic structure, so the first story, Sebastian, the narration dialogue is entirely in Spanish because it takes place in Mexico and all the characters are Spanish speakers. The second short story, Luz, has narration in Spanish and dialogue is mostly in English because it takes place in Texas, unless when there are Spanish speakers conversing with each other. And the third short story, Maria Josefa, has narration primarily in English because that is Maria Josefa's preferred tongue, and dialogue kind of alternates between the two. So I figured it would be fun to read a bit of an excerpt from the first short story, Sebastian. So Sebastian was still in the field. The others had departed for the locker room hours ago. There was but one half-broken light straining to illuminate a tiny portion of the beaten brown grass, and the late winter Juarez rain had already worsened despite the earlier blanket heat. He noticed that a few of the 30 practice cones that he'd so meticulously assembled had been pushed slightly off-center by the storm. He sprinted over with tremendous urgency and straightened them with the same deliberate care that a veterinarian would give upon finding an injured fox in the wild. Everything must be perfect. I am finally going to play Saturday. Sebastian inhaled, as deep as his damaged lungs would allow him, and readied himself for his 20th run-through of the day with the cones. He'd long ago decided that 20 was the optimal number of repetitions for each of his various post-practice drills. 10 was too easy, but his torn hip flexors often threatened to rip further if he attempted 30. His younger teammates proudly referred to these self-flagellating exercises of Sebastian as hospital ball. As always, he practiced in the dark, far from where the sole functional light occupied its small space. But his mind kept drifting south to the screaming, suffocating Estadio Azteca, the cauldron of his boyhood team and soon-to-be opponent, Club America. Sebastian moved the tattered ball through the obstacles with neither speed nor particular agility, but there was a certain intensity hidden beneath his awkward movements. He maneuvered around the final cone with an uncharacteristic jolt of acceleration and felt emboldened to strike the ball on goal. Planting his setup foot, Sebastian hit the ball dead center with considerable pace from just outside the 18-yard box, and then watched his efforts soar far above the dilapidated crossbar, past the barbed wire fence surrounding the northwest segment of the field, and onto the abandoned railroad tracks that some gringo company had financed years prior, but never completed. Once a ball went over there, it was not to be found. Thank you so much.
How?
Later in the summer, I'm fine-tuning certain things, but I'd love to have it publicly available.
English is your first language. How did you find that your tone in writing changed between Spanish and English?
I think I try to write in Spanish like the same way I write in English, but I think definitely, just Spanish has a different rhythm to it, a different verb structure, is a different sort of pacing to it. So I definitely thought my tone changed a bit, even though I tried to make sure it didn't, but definitely changed some.
How does your own experience with soccer influence your writing of this book?
Sure. So I played way too competitive soccer for most of my life, and I was always kind of fascinated with like my teammates who still to this day are like trying to like play professionally, and they're just not going to make it. They're playing in like Cincinnati for the 4th division team in U.S. soccer, and they're making $2,000 a year, and they're just not going to make it. But there's still there's this sense of determination to get out every morning and train from 6 a.m., wake up, do it again the next day, when there's just not going to make money in this sport. And it's really, I don't know, to me that seemed like a tragedy, but I also was just kind of interested by how people would pursue a dream like that. So that kind of inspired the other stories as well. Yes, Mr. Daly.
Yeah. First of all, I read every single one of these. Sounds amazing. My question though is, you wrote in your description that they can be standalone stories, but there is an overarching narrative.
Yeah.
So what was the purpose of that? My guess is your refutation of the American dream, but I don't know if you had any other purpose.
I kind of wanted to make it so if you could just read one of the stories, you would get a sense of what I was trying to do, but they would also sort of work in tangent with the other two stories to provide some sense of closure and some sense of progression. And I wanted to, all three of the characters are in this family, but they're also somewhat isolated from each other throughout each of the short stories. And I wanted to show how this sense of isolation in families, you know, as we move countries, as we move jobs, as we move what interests us and change relationships. So I kind of wanted to see if you could write something that could stand alone, but also be interconnected. Yes.
So obviously their background and life experiences are very different than yours. How did you inform those experiences? Did you use like interviews, other sources, or did you base it more on like the core emotions behind certain like experiences that are generalizable to people as a whole?
Yeah, I tried to make it universal. I did talk to like people like who did share sort of the similar cultural background. And I talked a lot to my advisor about trying really. I really wanted the work to be honest more than anything. I obviously I cannot really imagine what it's like to be a 28-year-old drug-addicted second division Mexican soccer player in 2008. But what I can do, hopefully, is imbue the story with a sense of authenticity and just really just try to be honest to what I think human emotions are and what human motivations and characteristics tend to be. And I did that the best I could. Definitely, though, I wouldn't say it's like 100%, you know, culturally or linguistically accurate. I think that'd be impossible.